All right, welcome back. In this video, we're going to focus on the hormonal control within our skeletal system. So we've already talked in this lesson about the importance of calcium in bone growth, right? Calcium phosphate is an important mineral that helps bone have its rigidity and hardness. And if you recall from our nervous system chapter, we know that calcium is also important in allowing us to release neurotransmitters. A couple of things we haven't discussed yet is the importance of calcium in our muscle contractions and in the ability for us to clot our blood and for some specialized cells in the heart called the pacemaker cells. But we do know, because we learned this from the very first lesson, is that most things are regulated, right? We have homeostasis, so we have a certain range that things are regulated in our body. The same thing is true for calcium levels in our blood. This calcium range should stay within a certain upper and lower limit. Now we're going to review really quickly about vitamin D and how it's activated. So if you think back to our lesson 5 when we talked about the integumentary system and we looked at our skin and we realized that when the skin is exposed to UV light, it converts a molecule into vitamin D3. We can also get vitamin D3 in our diet, right? We can take supplements and our milk is fortified and some foods contain that, but our skin can produce it, we can get it in our diet. Once it's in our blood, it travels to the liver, it goes through a conversion, and then that travels through the blood to the kidneys. The kidneys carry out another conversion, and that final active form of vitamin D is called calcitriol. And you're thinking, why are we going back to vitamin D? Well, you probably are making that connection because we know now that vitamin D plays an important role in our absorption of calcium. And that's because the active form of vitamin D called calcitriol helps our small intestines to absorb that calcium and it cross into our bloodstream. So we don't cover the digestive system in AMP1, but the majority of your nutrients are absorbed from the small intestine into your bloodstream. So this particular molecule is helping you make the most, if you will, to get the biggest bang for the buck of the calcium that you're eating in your diet. So it's helping you to absorb the majority of that calcium. So that's raising the calcium levels in your blood, right? If you have if you have calcitriol, right, that's helping to increase the calcium that's being absorbed in your bloodstream because it's taking it from the food you eat in your small intestine, helping it to diffuse into your bloodstream. Now, there are 2 hormones that we're going to talk about that aid in the regulation of calcium in the bloodstream. So remember, this is a homeostatic mechanism. Now, I first want to point out, calcitonin is different, okay? We just talked about calcitriol, right? That's the active form of vitamin D3 that's helping you absorb your calcium in your diet. This is a hormone. This is different, okay? So we have 2 hormones that are what we call antagonistic. In other words, they're doing opposite things of one another. And that's how we're keeping these calcium levels regulated in our blood. Now, these are hormones. Those are just chemical messengers or chemical signals that travel through our bloodstream. Hormones are typically produced by endocrine glands. So we have the parathyroid gland here and the thyroid gland. Now, just to show you an image of where that thyroid gland is, if you're having trouble remembering from our first lesson, here's our thyroid gland. So this is the anterior view that you see. This side over here, this is the posterior view. So what you can see is the parathyroid glands are these small little glands that are sort of embedded in that thyroid gland. So calcitonin is a hormone that's secreted by the thyroid gland. Parathyroid hormone is made and secreted by the parathyroid gland. Now, as I mentioned, these 2 hormones are antagonistic. So the parathyroid hormone is responsible for increasing blood calcium levels. Calcitonin is responsible for decreasing blood calcium levels. So in other words, when the blood calcium level gets too low, right, that's going to trigger the parathyroid to produce the parathyroid hormone, which we'll talk about how does this actually increase blood calcium levels. Opposite, when the calcium levels are too high, then that's going to trigger the thyroid gland to produce calcitonin, which will help bring those calcium levels back into homeostasis. Now let's dig into how do these hormones carry out that regulation of calcium. So we'll start with the parathyroid hormone, okay? So we already talked about what calcitriol does. So remember, this is the active form of vitamin D3, right? Calcitriol. So parathyroid hormone increases the conversion of the inactive form to the active form of calcitriol in the kidneys. So if we have more calcitriol, that's going to have the small intestines absorb more calcium, right? Or more calcium from our small intestines will be absorbed. So that's one way we increase the production of calcitriol, which increases our absorption of calcium from the small intestine. Now, the two together, parathyroid hormone and calcitriol, that's, remember, active vitamin D3, those are going to play a role in increasing our osteoclast activity. Remember, osteoclasts, they break down bone, right? Well, if you break down bone, you're releasing calcium, right? Because there's calcium stored in that mineral matrix. So if I break it down, I'm going to be releasing calcium salts or calcium ions into the blood. The other thing is they're going to trigger or signal to the kidneys, make sure as you're filtering our blood, right, that you're doing the very best job you can of reabsorbing any calcium ions and not releasing it into the urine. So those are two ways that these work together. They break bone tissue, which releases calcium into the blood, and they trigger the kidneys to do a better job of reabsorbing any calcium ions. Now, what about calcitonin? So it's going to have the opposite role, right? It's going to work to reduce our blood calcium levels when they get too high. So how does it do that? Well, it decreases the osteoclast activity. So in other words, it says, no, don't break down any more bone tissue. I don't want any more calcium released in the blood. It also triggers the kidneys to go ahead, right? Release that calcium into the urine. We don't need to retain as much calcium in our blood. So these are acting opposite of one another. And we're going to talk about how that, we're going to sort of review that with our homeostatic loop on the next slide. So let's think about this in terms of homeostasis, right? If we think back to when we talked about homeostasis, we know that there's a stimulus that occurs, right, that triggers a receptor to recognize something. So let's say our stimulus is that we have calcium levels are elevated, right? We have too high of calcium. So a receptor is going to have to recognize or detect that. So either cells in our parathyroid gland or our kidneys recognize calcium levels are too high. So we have to have an effector that's going to respond, right, to this stimulus. So when calcium levels are too high, which gland is going to respond to that? So that's going to be our thyroid gland, okay? And what does it do? Well, it is going to trigger the thyroid gland to produce calcitonin, right? That's the hormone produced by the thyroid gland. And what does calcitonin do? Well, remember, it's going to tell the kidneys, it's okay, don't absorb as much calcium, go ahead and release some calcium into the urine. And then it's going to tell the small intestine, you don't need to spend as much time, right? Don't absorb so much calcium. And it's going to inhibit these bone-breaking cells, the osteoclasts. So it won't allow the bone to be broken down and release that calcium. Okay? So until things return back to the level that we want, right? Our healthy level of calcium in the blood. Now let's erase and say that calcium is too low. So we don't have enough calcium in our blood. So again, we have to have receptor cells that recognize calcium levels are too low, either in the kidney or the parathyroid gland. And our effector in this case is going to be the parathyroid gland. Okay? So remember, the parathyroid are these 4 small embedded areas. Okay? And the parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. What is the action, or what is the result of parathyroid hormone? Well, it's going to have an effect on the kidneys, right? It tells the kidneys reabsorb as much calcium as you can. Calcium levels are low. It's going to tell the small intestine, along with, remember, we have this, calcitriol, right? This active form of vitamin D3 works with the parathyroid hormone to increase the amount of calcium that is being absorbed from our small intestine. And lastly, the parathyroid hormone is going to act on stimulating these bone breaking cells, the osteoclasts. So when you break down that bone matrix, right, you're releasing calcium into the blood. So that's going to continue until we get our calcium level raised to a healthy level. So that's why we think of these two hormones as being antagonistic, right? They're working in opposite to make sure we have our healthy, stable level of calcium in our blood. So we discussed the 2 hormones that regulate blood calcium levels. These are some other hormones that play a role in our bone growth and maintenance. So this first one here, growth hormone. So this is a hormone that's produced by our anterior pituitary gland, which triggers the liver to produce something called insulin-like growth factor. Ultimately, what that does is it increases our cartilage growth at the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate. So it helps our bones grow longer. The thyroid hormone is going to essentially increase the activity of our osteoblasts, our bone building cells. Now, the steroid hormones are very interesting, testosterone and estrogen. So when you think about like adolescence, there's typically a rapid growth, right? In adolescence, when we see an increase in these hormones. That's because these hormones are going to accelerate our bone growth. However, they also bring an end to our growth plate or our epiphyseal plate, because even though it's causing bone growth and cartilage growth, it actually accelerates the bone growth faster, and so eventually it will mineralize over that growth plate and we'll have the epiphyseal line, and so it both promotes but then ultimately ends our bone growth. Okay, glucocorticoids. So these are things like prednisone that if given as prescriptions, they can reduce the bone growth because they reduce growth at the epiphyseal plate. Serotonin, it turns out that our bone cells actually have receptors for serotonin. And if serotonin is at high circulating levels, what it will do is it essentially stops, these stem cells, right, our osteoprogenitor cells, when they divide or differentiate into osteoblasts, these are our bone builders, right? So if the serotonin levels are too high, this can really cause this differentiation piece, this step where the stem cells become osteoblasts. It can sort of reduce the occurrence of that, so ultimately we don't have as many osteoblasts that are building bone.